Hello again and welcome to Catholic Social Teaching 101. It's the 14th in our series. We're here with the guest that you may have visited with last program. We have Dr. Mark Baker from Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary, a professor of mission. We have on his side a friend of mine who is also Mennonite, who is Sheri Wiedenhoefer, who will tell you a little bit more about a ministry that she is very engaged in right now. And finally, to the far end, we have Ivan Paz, who is a new friend of mine, a student of Mark's, a good friend of Sheri and Mark, who is going to share with us where we left off last session, the unavoidable and the very urgent issue of dealing with racism as a criminal justice issue. It just can't be put off another day. So on that note, I wonder if Mark and then Sheri and Ivan could tell us just a little bit more about themselves, so as you share, people will understand from where you come. So Mark.
So yeah, something in relation. I've been living here in Fresno for 18 years. Before that, I lived in Central America, and so part of what I bring to this is having lived, in the 80s in Central America and experienced violence there. That raised questions which were very transformative for me. And on this particular topic of restorative justice, my own experience is important, but also, I'm a teacher, and so I seek to help my students imagine new things, imagine possibilities. And on the issue of peacemaking, being agents of peace, which I think all of us Christians are called to. One thing I do is I tell stories of restorative justice. And so, actually, someone like Sheri, hearing her tell stories from actual practice of restorative justice gives me all kinds of excitement about this topic, and I'm glad to be here today.
I'm just so glad you're back again, Mark. Sheri, tell us just a little bit about CoSA and Father Jim Torrens, how you are connected with the great Father Jim.
The great Father Jim has been a wonderful volunteer for CoSA for many, many years. And he has seen, and he would be a great person to talk to, actually, about the things that he's seen with people that have come through CoSA. CoSA stands for Circles of Support and Accountability. It was started by Mennonites in Canada almost 30 years ago, run through the Department of Corrections, for the most part, in Canada, and was started in the U.S. and funded through the Second Chance Grant, U.S. funding here in Fresno, to Fresno Pacific University, to the Center of Peacemaking. Circles of Support and Accountability we have a few other programs going on in the United States, but Fresno's is unique in that we are working with people that are being released from serving their time. I have to say I've learned a lot in my life, but I have never been in such an area that has surprised me about what happens when you are released from prison, the lack of resources that are there. And even when we look at, even if we look at Prop 57, we talk about rehabilitation in prison, really the question is, how do we reenter? How do we come back to a community? How do we restore ourselves and our communities when someone is released? So we work with a primary population of those who have committed sex offenses, which is a real challenge. Lots in the news, lots of things going on there. But it also is a population that really doesn't recidivate, and there's a lot of misunderstandings and wrong narratives about that as well. So CoSA just works with people that are coming back from prison. We work with a group of 4 or 5 trained volunteers, and then they walk with this person for a year or two as they reenter into community.
Thank you for sharing, but also for that work you do with CoSA. I know Father Jim finds it one more of his beautiful ministries that he shares with the diocese. Very proud of that commitment and happy to do it, as he says. Happy to be serving in that difficult role that many others would shy from, would not go near it. Mm-hmm. Ivan, something else about yourself before we start talking about racism. Tell us a little bit more about you and why you're here today.
Okay, well, I find discussions about justice, criminal justice, things like that, very, very interesting. I think as I shared in the last show, a lot of it has to do with my personal life experiences, but I think also in the context of ministry, I've had I've really engaged some of the patterns of violence that I think some of the brokenness of our system contributes to. I have a gym where basically I work with teenagers in the downtown area, taking kids off the streets really, and what I'm dealing with is just really helping them develop a sense of leadership, a sense of stewarding their relationships, and then also knowing that God loves them. But I think I'm also trying to help them understand the importance of nonviolence. And the way I'm doing this is through martial arts. It's kind of weird.
Wow.
I'm using martial arts to sort of subvert the pattern of urban violence in the neighborhood. Share more about that another time. But yeah, I'm constantly wrestling with the practice of helping these young people find a different way of handling conflict, and then also how that connects to my personal theology.
One thing that those that watched the program last time, Program 13, is we closed on a very, very powerful, heavy note, is the racial bias, the racism that's just at the base of criminal justice system, like it or not. It just is. The system has this major flaw. It's just major. You don't have to have read Michelle Alexander. Mm-hmm. You could have read anybody that writes seriously, but she writes beautifully, exposing what is the issue. So maybe we could begin with our good friend Ivan, who was on this a little bit at the end of the program. Ivan, begin again with how racism became so clear to you, and maybe some of its root cause, and hopefully we could get some positive things about what can we do about this. So let's begin with what you noticed and why that bothered you so much.
Yeah, I think I'll just stick to the first piece of the question, and that's really like my experience of becoming aware of this race-driven policing, or even the way our criminal justice system interacts with race. And I think as a kid, I've always kind of like saw value in becoming an officer. We played good cops and, robbers and all this stuff. But I think I also began to realize, in the context in which I was growing up, as the son of an immigrant family in a community that was predominantly immigrant, Spanish-speaking, probably undocumented, was that the law was not necessarily for us. And we saw them in ways in which, like, by seeing the officers, the way they monitor our neighborhoods, the fear that people had towards law enforcement. But at a personal level, I think I experienced hardship when my dad was deported. I was 7 years old. He was deported. And I think that's when I began to realize, like, hey, I'm growing up in a... sorry, let me backtrack. I think also the rhetoric on television, the rhetoric against the undocumented community, the kind of terms that were used to define us, like my relatives, illegal, criminal. A lot of the rhetoric that seems to pop up in a lot of Trump speech. But I think I became really aware of it when I became a teenager. Mostly I used to follow the crowd in the neighborhood who would say, things like F the police, and stuff like that. But then until I got pulled over and then beaten by the officers, held at 8 p.m., and then booked into juvenile hall with the accusation that I was out past curfew, which was interesting. And my mom could not do anything about that. Nothing was ever resolved. I realized that I was a target. And now I'm 34 years old. I have friends that are police officers, people that love God, people that are honestly trying to serve the community. But I'm still scarred by some of those issues, and I'm trying to figure out what does it mean to be a brother in Christ with some of these people. So it's a process. But I continue to live in a neighborhood of high crime and high poverty, and I still continue to see the very same patterns I experienced as a kid among my neighbors. And so I'm asking the same questions that I think a lot of people in this country are asking. What is up? What's up with the police departments in our neighborhoods? What's going on? And so, yeah, it's a question that I'm also thinking a lot about these days.
Academically, let's move to Mark on this one. Is there anything that you're seeing in what Ivan's sharing and what he's written for you for reports and his thesis that kind of like you as an academic, what is your read on what's going on with the criminal justice system and its racial, not only profiling, but its own understanding of itself as racially biased, that is basically flawed in its structure?
Well, I think a beautiful thing about being a professor, and especially a professor, master's level at seminary, is it's conversation. So, Ivan and I have been having conversation for a number of years now, and so I'm going to end up, asking him to take the microphone again. But to bring it up to the point, in response to your question, so when I first met Ivan, he was quite passionate about restorative justice, but his atonement theology was very different from mine, and I thought in tension with his restorative justice. And I can remember quite passionately saying, Ivan, how can you think that way about the cross? Because it's undermining what you're saying about restorative justice. And that took us some time to have that conversation, but I think he would say, so on that one, he benefited from my input. But then he went on and he dug deeper and came to realize, I need to get beyond just think about the cross, but how we think about sin has implications for how we think about cross, how we think about justice. And so on that part of the conversation, I've been paying attention to him and learning from him. And I want to underline a couple things. So one thing I think Ivan says is really very helpful, and he mentioned in the previous show, is when we're talking about this topic of justice and retributive justice, justice that understands justice being payback, punishment, we're hoping, say, through Prop 57, to improve our criminal justice system in relation to that issue. But I think Ivan helpfully points out it's not just the criminal justice system. This concept of justice filters down through all of society, so that includes the people who are the target of the criminal justice system, as well as those who feel like they're targeted by the criminal element. I mean, it's throughout. So this is, I think, a place where the church has a huge role, because it's not just one segment that's a problem there. And so that's something I've gotten from Ivan. But then also, I think, really his pressing the point on how you think about sin can either make it easier for one to embrace the kind of things that the bishops are calling for in relation to these propositions, of recognizing every human has the potential of being redeemed through Jesus Christ. That potential is there. But Ivan, in his thesis, and this is where I'll ask him to talk more about it, is, but if your view of sin is that the human is just fundamentally damaged goods, it's much easier to go the way of retributive justice and just view them as a crime neighborhood.
They gave me that signal again, which is helpful, that we take our break, and we will be back for the final segment of our program in 1 minute. Stay tuned.
Celebrate Sunday Mass with KNXT from beautiful St. Anne's Chapel every Sunday at 7:30 a.m. and again at 5 p.m. This weekly broadcast of the Sunday Mass has become the cornerstone of diocesan evangelization, touching thousands of viewers, both Catholic and non-Catholic alike, with the Word of God and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Sunday Mass from St. Anne's Chapel, 7:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. on KNXT TV, your Catholic television station.
Welcome back to the second part of our program of Catholic Social Teaching 101, Part 14. And what we're going to do right now is have Sheri join us regarding the issue of how early this discrimination of sorts, this profiling, this selective, different disciplining starts. It starts early. It starts in school. So maybe, Sheri, where would you like to lead us?
Well, I think it's just important to note that we are understanding racism not only in the criminal justice system but also in the academic systems, and that is really the starting point for people being incarcerated, being bad on the streets. So the disproportionality that is being studied very intensely in the United States for discipline in schools. Discipline also has a retributive school in the schools. You get kicked out of school, zero tolerance. I mean, Fresno, we have our own issues. Every school district does. So when you take that in schools and you start that young, it's just an extension. So when they call the school to prison pipeline they call it that because it's the same system of justice that leads you to the same place. And in Fresno, we're adopting a new motto, cradle to career, but it cannot be a disguise for really the disproportionality in discipline. Part of that has to do with not having those restorative options in schools. I believe that restorative justice can be an equalizer for disproportionality, but we have to be clear on what restoring things and making things right are. So anyway, it's integrated into all of our functioning as society. In every sector, we have those options for making things as right as possible instead of punishing and pushing people out and excluding folks. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of our schools and how important it is that we continue to focus there.
Ivan, how would you like to respond to things that Mark had proposed and that Sheri just interjected? Where do you see that being very true, that it actually does have some roots right there at our public school system and, who knows, Catholic school system?
Well, I'm going to go back to my transparency. When I was in the 7th grade, that was the first time I was arrested. And the first time I was incarcerated, I think it was not too long after that. And what's really interesting is that period of my life, when I was in middle school, I was going through, any middle schooler goes through a really hard time, right? But having a deported father, growing up in what I was becoming well aware of, that I was basically living in the ghetto, the pain of poverty, things of that nature. Like, there was a lot of pain in my life. And at the same time, I think I was, at the same time I was being bullied at school. And when I responded with violence, then I was arrested because the school had a zero tolerance policy. And that was the first time I went into juvenile hall, and I was so scared. And after I got through that period, I wasn't scared anymore. And it was really interesting that from that moment on, I actually identify that as a period where I began my career as a delinquent or a juvenile, because I began to get arrested for a lot of other things. And I was actually excited to go back in and be reunited with the officers and the other kids that were constantly getting incarcerated. And that ended up culminating with a 5-year prison sentence, California Department of Corrections. But what's really interesting is how much this pipeline thing was a part of my life. And it started with a kid who didn't know how to articulate his emotions and pain, was punished for responding to bullying, and ended up becoming a criminal. I would say a lot of that catalyzed me in that direction. So I think there are other ways that could have been that I could have been dealt with, and maybe creating spaces for me to be fully restored. maybe to connect with the bully and have a conversation.
Can I interject on that?
Yeah.
Because Reedley Peace Building Initiative has done where it's connected the schools and the police department and the entire community together on that. So if you were bullied in 7th grade, you would sit across from the kid you bullied. If you bullied that kid or if the kid bullied you, you would sit across. These, mostly end in tears because families are there. You're understanding that one conflict has been because someone else. There's fantastic, amazing stories. They've kept 270 kids in Reedley out of the criminal justice system in the last 3 years doing this program, doing a restorative justice program, but the schools, the cities, and volunteers from the community. They have 70 trained volunteers doing mediations for kids. You would not have had that experience had you been in Reedley today. You wouldn't have had that experience. So it is possible to create those kinds of avenues that you're talking about. I think we're waking up.
Sheri, I have a question for you, and I wanted to ask this in the first show, and it was on the practice of restitution that counties and the state often practice. Because one of the things that you shared in the previous show was that people are pretty satisfied with this restorative justice model. Have you found in your line of work that people are just as satisfied with money that is being given back to them in the form of restitution, or do people even see that?
Well, if you're in the criminal justice system, you do not see it. And so it's very dissatisfying. In fact, you will find, especially in high school type conflicts, you'll find kids they have a fight. They don't even know if another kid has been charged. They don't ever know what happens. The victim never knows what happens to the person that maybe was the offender. They don't even know the process in that system. So on the restitution piece, if you take it out of the courts and you put it into the hands of the victims, what you tend to have is you'll have that paid off, as we know, often 100% of the time. But the other thing you'll have happen is the father of a kid that got bullied will say, hey, do you need some work done at your house? Hey, I've got something you could do, and I can give you a job. I'll give you your first job. We'll do this thing. So these relationships get built between victim and offenders. And again, you can see then how there's an opportunity for everybody. And it takes away, and I believe the most biblical sense of it is taking away the labels of victim and offender. And it's just how we are working our lives out together, in the most peaceful way. So I think we're waking up.
Mark, you seem to be weighing in there as an academic and as a Christian and as a person who sees that principles of theology impact life. What do you see? What do you see as the root of what is the possible solution to this?
Well, I think it's multifaceted, and I would be glad to sit here and just listen to Sheri tell some more stories. But to bring in some of the facets from my side as theologian, I'm going to circle back to what Ivan brought up in the previous show about sin. And so what's your concept of sin? And again, I think Augustine got us off track here in making sin so physical. Almost, genetic or biological in the semen. And I think if you think of sin that way, then we're just going to try to control because we all have this evil gene in us. But for many theologians pre-Augustine and still, the Eastern Orthodox Church, their view of sin is still it's relational. And so if you get down to why are we sinners, and again to Ivan's thesis, he is not at all denying that there's sin. He, as well as anyone, knows and has experienced sin. But it's the question of when you get down to the root, what's the root cause? And it makes a huge difference if you think the root cause is broken relationship or it's this evil cancer within us. Because evil cancer, we as humans, we can't do anything. It's surgery. You can't get it out. But it's broken relationship, then anything we're doing to restore relationship is bringing people more in line to be the person God created them to be. So I think a theological contribution to it is what I would call healthier theological thinking. That's a contribution. Then I think as well, we need other models and we need other mentalities. So I think, and it's great that you have all three of us here involved in different ways.
Well, and the truth be told about restorative justice, they have come from, restorative justice was practiced in indigenous communities far before. You don't tend to find restorative justice in institutionalized, settings. You actually tend to find more top-down discipline measures or punitive type measures than that, I think. But indigenous communities really have been doing it for centuries. So we're actually, that's the most human form of, I think, getting along with each other, right?
This has been all I could have hoped for, these two programs with our guests. I just want to throw in one thing, a little bit, might seem off point, but maybe not. You never know. Pope Francis has just decided to have a new dicastery, and what he's done is subsume 4 divisions, 4 departments, 4 dicasteries into one. And he gave it this awesome name that I know you will like. It's called Integral Human Development. And what this is what used to be the old peace and justice commitment of Cardinal Turkson and some other things that deal with the most urgent human needs of mental health, the disadvantaged, the unemployed, the physically challenged, all the people who are on immigrants, refugees. All of this ministry is under now, January 1st it starts, Cardinal Turkson. So it's almost as if the Pope himself, from Latin America, from Argentina, with that wonderful experience that he did have as a Archbishop of the conference of those bishops that were very much guided in their document on Aparecida when they wrote that very enlightened teaching. Restorative justice, I think, is at its root. It's a new way of looking at community, a new way of looking at church. So I want to thank Mark and Sheri and Ivan for coming to us as non-Catholics to share the richness of their commitment to what we find a Catholic principle. It never means to say, well, it's ours and people use it too. It's a shared principle, but it is one of ours that we are working with to change our attitudes. What was very enlightening to me in this last session is Sheri making the point, it's not just the criminal justice system, it's all relationships. If this is implemented, this understanding of this relational, non-judgmental, non-punitive approach to relationship, we will have a different way to be as families, as individuals, and as church. We hope you enjoyed our program. Hope to see you next month. God bless.